this stuff has actually been happening for a really, really, really long time. Web3 has been emerging for a long period of time. We as a species have been building towards Web3 deliberately. This isn't something that, just sort of came up by accident. Like, we have intelligently and deliberately been building toward this moment. So what is Web3? And we can even talk about what is Web4 and what is Web5.
Stick with Web3 for now.
Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning. Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
Last time on this podcast, we took you down the rabbit hole that is Web3 with an internet entrepreneur as your guide, and you seem to like it. So we're doing it again. Only this time we're going down that rabbit hole with someone who's more of a learning person. A real training world insider, in fact. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact. Tell us about her.
Hack Facts.
Trish Uhl is founder and CEO of Owl's Ledge LLC, a firm that helps learning professionals improve their performance, drive business results, and produce organisational outcomes. She works with Global 500 and Fortune 500 clients on 4 continents. She describes herself as a technologist and trainer to her core, having spent more than 2 decades leading transformation projects, starting with computer automation and distance education in the 1990s. She also has a degree in equestrian studies.
So, Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact, standing in for Jay Curtis, Head of Themes, who has taken her young children to the West Country for half term. What did we talk about?
You actually talked quite a lot about dressage.
There's a horse theme on this show recently, isn't there?
Yes, there is. Another ongoing theme is talking to the business, and Trish had really interesting things to say about that. But the major theme was Web3 and how it's going to affect not only learning professionals, but everybody in the people function quite profoundly.
What Trish really added to my understanding when it comes to Web3 is seeing money as measurement and work as a type of value exchange that might not always take place under the same set of rules and norms as it does right now. I'm a bit of a skeptic on blockchain, but Trish has a passion for the subject and a lively intelligence that tends to sweep you along. When most of us trot, if we dare to tread at all, she gallops. You almost want to slow her down so we can catch up, but as with a great racehorse, it's inspiring to see her in full flight.
So Trish, welcome to The Learning Hack. It's a real pleasure to have you. I've watched your presentations at Learning Technologies in London in the days of in-person events, and others on video, as many people around the world will have done. And you're always really impressive, I find. An expert, of course, in data science, analytics, and emerging technology. We always give our guests biogs in outline in the intros, as you'll know, having watched some of them. But to humanize that a little, can you tell us how you came to be doing what you do? How did you find this interest and curiosity in being a learning engineer, if I can call you that, in your career?
Yeah, so it's in a roundabout way, as is the case for many of us in our careers, right? So I was born into an engineering family. My father is a now retired nuclear engineer, and I spent an awful lot of time growing up actually next to nuclear power plants and Navy facilities because of my father's background and the nature of his work. So some people would say, of course, well, that makes sense, right? Now we can understand part of me, but I was always on the people side. I didn't think at the time when I was younger that I had actually inherited my father's genes for engineering, because he's the math nerd and he was the one who started out with the computer sciences. And I had the benefit of growing up in a household where we had personal computers from the time that personal computers first became available. So back in the days of Commodore 64s and Apple IIes and, those types of things. So my So my background actually started out as an equestrian, as a competitor in equestrian events.
Yeah.
And when you're an athlete, one of the things that you know about being an athlete is you always know what your standings are. And not only your standings as an athlete, as a rider, but also the standings of the horse that you have the great pleasure of being able to work with. So I learned a couple of things at a very early age. One was this whole sort of engineering paradigm from watching my father and being around my father's work. And the second was this whole idea of using data in order to be able to manage a career that had to do with not only managing my own career, but these assets that I was given access to, the horses. And I often was paid as a rider to compete other people's horses. And so, performance matters in that particular case. If you don't keep up the performance and stay ahead in the rankings, both as a rider and in terms of being able to showcase this asset, this horse, in the best light, you don't get more opportunities to ride and compete. And so you get really, really good at analytics and data, even though that you're the equestrian kid and didn't think that that was sort of your background. But in context, that really helped.
Interesting that. My father was an engineer, actually, but I'm almost completely innumerate, no good at maths, did an English literature degree. But that equestrian background is really interesting. And am I right in thinking you did a degree, your first degree in equestrian studies?
So the focus of my undergraduate was equestrian studies and actually communications. And I actually never finished my degree. There's a whole other story about that for perhaps another podcast. But yeah, that was my original study. But the short side to that was I was competing actually in 3-phase eventing. So my first professional certification was actually as a British Horse Society instructor. I used to train people on dressage. And so you learn at that time where you're standing in a ring and you're riding boots and you have green horses and green people that you can pretty much at that point kind of stand in any kind of classroom after that. Yeah. So I, after an accident that ended at that time, my athletic career, car accident, I had grown up as this, again, this kind of nerdy kid playing with computer games and always having access to that kind of technology. And so I was able to literally transfer all of this work that I had done in horse stables and stable management and in this riding career. And I suddenly found myself in the wacky, wacky world in the 1990s of IT, in the very beginnings of information technology and, bringing that into the workplace and the whole sweep of the first wave of computer automation.
Well, having watched my videos, you know that I am, as we speak, Googling dressage GIFs to put in the introduction.
Good. Fabulous. There's some really good ones. and a quick note on that, because this will be fun. So do you know where dressage came from?
France.
No, actually, the Spanish school in Austria, but
right. Okay.
Dressage.
I was going by the name, the word dressage.
Yes. Oh, sure. So, but dressage, the discipline, is actually, we were training the horses for war movements. So if you watch dressage and you see how the horses will like kick out and rear and do all these other kinds of crazy things, those are all movements meant for battle.
So you cover a lot of bases in the stuff that you talk about now. But there are a few areas in particular I'd like to ask you about. And one of these is an ongoing theme we have on the podcast this season, which is talking to the business, L&D talking to the business. How can L&D be a better business partner in essence? The major recommendation of a previous guest on the pod that we had, Stefan van Hooijdonk, is in this regard was that the answer lies in data. L&D needs to get comfortable with data so it can have adult-to-adult conversations. And I know you've talked about this issue a lot. Now, usually this topic starts with L&D getting a hard time for being behind the curve or data phobic. It's not moving as quickly in L&D as in other parts of the organization. But I always wonder if maybe there are other reasons why the takeoff has been slow. Does the answer perhaps lie in the nature of learning data? We know that learning is a really difficult thing to quantify. Does L&D have particular data issues that make it harder for them than obviously for their accounts people? It's very number based, but marketing people or whoever else in the organization. Not trying to let L&D off the hook particularly here, but I suppose I'm asking how particular and different to other types of business information is the data that learning professionals need to use, and therefore the way they need to use it?
Yeah, so that's a very large question. So let me see if I can try and streamline a response. I'm not usually known for such things, so let's give it a whirl. So going back to the learning engineering kind of paradigm for a moment, being a learning engineer means looking at learning systems from more of an engineering kind of perspective. So when I look at leadership development as an example, I would call that a learning system. So not the technology, but we have a plan, right? So let's say that we're doing leadership development, we're taking high potentials as one example, and we believe that there's a 2-year period or a 1-year period that we're going to work with them, and that there are these different instructional events, and maybe there are these individual types of activities that they do throughout this entire system, right? So we're talking about the system, the continuum. And then maybe at the end of 12 months, let's say at the end of this leadership development program, participants are going to have a capstone project that they're going to present back to leadership. So our role in L&D and being able to orchestrate across that entire system, if I'm looking at that from an engineering standpoint, I'm looking as an engineer would for points of failure. So I'm looking at where are the different opportunities, where are the different opportunities and milestones where we might be able to get some data that would give us a feedback loop to let us know if the program's on track or not, if the participants are on track or not, if the cohorts are on track or not. And if they're not, we would be able to intervene in some kind of way. So there would be something in the data that, number one, would be a diagnostic or an assessment, a formative assessment that would come back and tell us sooner rather than later, because, as Lou Russell, the great queen of project management, would say, bad news early is good news. So we want to know in that short intervals, kind of where are people at. So if I'm looking at it as an engineer, number one, I'm looking at the interconnectivity of things. I'm looking at it from a systems thinking point of view, and especially since we're talking about human beings, it's dynamic, right? It's in flux. There are all sorts of other pressures that are happening on the people that are participating in this particular cohort to go on this particular journey of development. And so we have to look at not only the system that we have some influence over, that learning system, we have to also consider the external pressures. What are the externalities to that system? Because our learning solutions don't exist in a vacuum. They're not isolated. They are certainly subject to the other external pressures that are happening in the organization, that are happening in society, that are happening in community, that are happening around the world. So how do we look at those external pressures that are putting pressure on the system? How do we look at the internal factors that are happening within our learning system? And then how do we instrument that learning system in a way where we get these feedback loops that give us enough information to, number one, again, flag us down and say, hey, something's going on here. And number two, provide us with some information, or at least an opportunity that we could go in and provide more of a diagnostic to figure out what's happening, and then select the right intervention and then test for that and sort of move along. So as an engineer, you're looking for points of failure and you're looking for managing risk, right? So we're trying to manage the risk of attrition. We're trying to manage the risk of non-performance or underperformance of our participants across this system. Because again, if we think about the more holistic view of why it is that we have people in this leadership development continuum or in this learning system in the first place, is to be able to develop the talent pipeline that's needed for succession later on. So we need this system to work, and we need the performers in the system to be able to be successful in navigating the system and achieve, the development opportunities in order to be ready for what's next and what's ahead for them. So a thing on that, John, is we often talk about like the language of business. So how do you have a conversation with business about? And I think we have a hang up. There are some things that we really have a hang up about. So when we talk about money and people, we often in L&D or in any of the people professions, we have sort of this aversion that somehow we're replacing people with money. And I'm not saying that that's not valid. There are good reasons for that in a number of our different organizational experiences in our organizational life, where we might feel that by introducing money to the equation and using money as part of the language of business, that it's somehow diminishing human beings. But I would also suggest that we think about money as just a form of measurement, that it's really, we're the ones that are putting the mental filter around what the context of the money is. But if we just use it as a measurement tool, and if we shifted our mindset to think about money as measurement, just as much as we would think about kilometers or we would think about inches, if we just looked at, if we sort of tabled, and then if we drove towards that, right? Because we get to control the use of how it is that we use money in terms of people. But the other language of business that I think people often miss or we don't really think about is the language of risk. So if we think about, again, if I'm having a conversation with a business leader about what's happening in this learning system that we've now instrumented to be able to get these feedback loops with data to be able to tell us kind of where we're at and what might, are we on course or not? Are we making progress or not? If there's something happening where I now need to engage the business to be able to have a conversation because we need to intervene, I'm probably in L&D, not the person that needs to intervene. It's probably somebody like the business leader or management in the sustaining environment that needs to take some kind of action. I'm going to have a conversation not with that individual or those stakeholders about learning. I'm going to talk about risk. So if we don't address X, whatever X is, whatever phenomena that's happening that's putting something about the program or our participants or that cohort in jeopardy, I'm going to have a conversation about risk. And what is the risk of not being able to move past this point? Or what is this risk? What is the risk of people not being able to progress? So I think that's one of the first things is it's a language issue, and we have some hangups about terms like money and measurements like money. And we don't have the language for some of these other languages that are used in business, like the language of risk.
Fascinating. That point about money as measurement, I think, comes to a theme that I want to talk about in a minute. But to kind of round this side of things off, if I can play that back to you in terms of my original question, it sounds like what you're saying is that, yes, there are individualities in the situation that we're looking at, things you don't see in other parts of the business, and a certain orientation of learning people and human resources people that is different, but it falls into a context of type of engineering-based view of organizations that you will see across organizations. When you talk about risk, you're very much talking the language of financial services profession and so on as well, and other parts of the business. Project managers are always dealing with risk, for instance, and those are transferable skills. So there's a kind of transferable skills side to this, and put it in the context of how you might look at other parts of the business and apply that to what is a very individual situation. But the methodology you're talking about there, the kind of engineering mindset, is something that has commonalities with the rest of the business. Is that a fair summary?
And that's what yes, absolutely. And that's what we're looking for, is we're looking for that universality and that commonality, right? So that now we are talking about the same types of things. It's not my L&D lexicon. It's not, learning science and those types of things. And not that that isn't important. Of course, that's important, but that's important for us to have as part of our internal process as an L&D team, as an L&D function, as an L&D industry. It's not, that's not really meant for the outside world. So I think that sometimes we have this confusion about what it means to speak the language of the business. It is looking for these commonalities and these universalities. And I would think that that some of these frameworks are pretty straightforward. Is it hard to kind of conceptualize?
No, I think it's right. Yeah, and if we kind of take an analogy with other disciplines within organizations, like marketing, for instance, I almost go on about it, but it's about the only thing I know. You can imagine a learning person coming out of a business meeting and say, well, this is terrible. These people have never heard of Gagne or Ebbinghaus. They don't know the first thing about learning. An analogy would be if a marketing person would get frustrated because their CEO had never heard of Clay Shirky, for instance, or Gary Vaynerchuk or whatever. That is very much a thing for your practice area to know about learning theory. But when you're talking to the business, you have to fall into that kind of conceptual framework, and it is a sort of engineering-based mindset.
And words really matter. So I benefited a lot from parts of my early part of my career was actually in one of the largest law firms in the United States. And I benefited from that because everything in a law firm is measured, because everything that happens in a law firm has to be charged back to somebody. So either it gets charged back to a client or it gets charged back to the firm. And you learn very quickly as somebody who is in a law firm that you figure out ways that are reasonable to charge back to a client, because if you're charging back to the firm, then you are having an impact directly on the equity partners' profitability of that firm. And what I learned actually kind of by accident, and it was a friend and colleague at the time, so shout out to Stephen Harris. What we learned very quickly as an early L&D team embedded within the IT organization at the firm was that if you started a conversation with one of the attorneys, we would start with the words "in pursuant to." And the minute that we used the phrase "in pursuant to," we had that person's attention, just because this is how powerful language is to us as humans, is that there are words that resonate. So if you start the conversation trying to talk about Gagne, if you start the conversation trying to talk about, the Kirkpatrick model or whatever, you're going to lose them because they're just going to check out. But if you start with, "Hey, can we have a conversation about risk?" You've got somebody's attention because that's already a trigger word that's on their radar.
The way we work has changed, and the way we learn is changing too. But 70% of organizations don't feel that their learning systems can really cope with all this change. It seems there is a disconnect between what learners need right now and what most learning suites provide. In a new white paper, Ben Betts and I tell the story of how this disconnect happened and lay out a vision for what a modern learning system ought to be and do. It's called Sweet Dreams, and you can read it now.
Meet the evolving nature of work with Cornerstone Explore, a holistic people growth experience that delivers a fully integrated, personalised journey of learning, skill development and career mobility for every person. I'd share all the ways Cornerstone Explore is designed and personalised for the ways your people want to grow and work, but this is only a 30-second ad. To learn how you can unite people growth with business success, visit csod.info/future ready.
Trish, anyone who looks at your LinkedIn profile will see a set of hashtags that immediately mark you out as someone with an interest in crypto, NFTs, and other Web3 topics. A lot of that stuff seems quite arcane to people. And I recently read a really interesting post of yours about talent marketplaces, blockchain, and social tokens. You have your own talent token. But as I say, a lot of people are just not at all up to speed with Web3 yet. We're starting to cover this quite a bit on the podcast because I think it's an important growing area. And you're obviously well in it. Can you explain a bit for learning people who maybe aren't really up to speed with this area, what Web3 means for learning and HR in your view, and how tokens and NFTs fit into that? Because I think a lot of people just think crypto, well, that's something to do with Elon Musk and speculating and doesn't have anything to do with me.
Yeah, these are really excellent questions. So, and this is going to be really important because we're going to have, as a practice, more and more of these conversations as these same technologies, including cryptocurrencies, come into operations. So one of the things about my practice over now almost 30 years is I am definitely one of those people with the old Gretzky quote about, I'm always skating to where the puck is going rather than where the puck currently is. And I'm or to put it with another phrase with some of the futurists, I'm always the scout that's out where the snow is melting, right? I'm always at the fringes looking at what is happening next, what's coming down that's going, again, what are those external forces that are going to have impact, on us as individuals, as human beings, as people with livelihoods and households and families, and of course our profession. But so what's happening now with Web3 has been happening for quite some time. And it's just that, of course, now we've hit that inflection point where suddenly there's a lot of this conversation in the mainstream press about it. And what I mean by that is that some of the underlying technologies, and I'll define Web3 in just a moment, but some of the underlying technologies, as an example, like blockchain, are now, blockchain actually just turned 30 years old. So one of the first things to help people understand is blockchain is not the same as Bitcoin, right? So Bitcoin is one of the early use cases of blockchain, but it's actually not the first use case of the blockchain technology. So what that means is that when we talk about a technology like blockchain, is that blockchain is a category of technology in much the same way as operating systems are a category of technology. So we would have different flavors of operating systems. We've got the Windows operating system, the Mac operating system, the Linux operating system. It's the same thing with blockchain. So we have different flavors of blockchain, and those have different architecture and different construction to them, in the same way that the Mac operating system is different than the Windows operating system, but they're both still operating systems. We have the same thing. So not all of the blockchains are actually use case or practical application the same, and the technology behind them isn't always the same. So that being said, this stuff has actually been happening for a really, really, really long time. Web3 has been emerging for a long period of time. We as a species have been building towards Web3 deliberately. This isn't something that, just sort of came up by accident. Like, we have intelligently and deliberately been building toward this moment. So what is Web3? And we can even talk about what is Web4 and what is Web5, because we even know what those phases are beyond Web3. But let's Web3. So Web3.
Stick with Web3 for now.
We'll stick with Web3 for right now, because it's happening now. So if we go back and look at Web3 in terms of what was Web 1 and what was Web 2. So Web 1 would have been the sweep of computer automation in the 1990s, which gave personal computers, because before that we had computers, but they took up whole rooms, right? So Web 1 was when we had the introduction of the World Wide Web in the early 1990s, and even more specifically, the introduction of the web browser in 1993. So the World Wide Web is just a component, many people don't know, is not the entirety of the internet. It's a component of the internet, and we suddenly had access to information. So if you think about Web 1 and early web pages and websites in the 1990s, they were static. Do you remember web pages in the 1990s? What was that experience like?
Oh, yes. I had an email. My first email address was actually a load of numbers.
Was it really?
Oh, yeah. So it was a company called, provider called CompuServe gave you an email address. They allotted it, and it was just a string of numbers.
So I had CompuServe, I had Prodigy, I had AOL. So you and I are from that same era. But John, what did the first, like the Web 1 websites look like? And what could you do with them?
They were very slow loading if they had images on them. I remember sitting, 15 minutes to look for a JPEG to download, so you could actually see it and stuff like that. The discussion side of it, the kind of Web 2 social side of it, I think started really early. You had all this kind of Usenet and stuff like that was around. But again, it was a bit arcane for most people. It wasn't something that generally people did. But it was primitive, slow,
so
clunky. But everyone was still getting very excited about it. And I was running training courses in the internet, actually, at the time. And there was a huge amount of excitement about things that haven't quite, we're waiting for the hockey puck to get there. So people always say at conferences, the pace of change in technology is incredibly fast. For me, it always seems sluggish. You know, we were all waiting for mobile learning for years and years. Every time we turn up at the annual exhibition at Learning Technologies that you've spoken at, we'd say, this is the year that mobile learning is going to break through? And it just never did until you had the smartphone.
And that was the inception, that was the inflection point, right, for Web 2. Yeah. So exactly. So if we think about Web 1 was about read only, right? It was about just being able to, we had these static websites where we could consume the information, but we didn't contribute to the information. Web 2, to your point, was the rise of social. But what really had social media really take off, and the way of us being able to not only read, but also write. So if Web 1 is read only, then Web 2 is read write. We suddenly had permission to start to contribute our own content.
And accessible, usable
again,
tools.
The inflection point for that was actually the advent of accessible that we have on our person all of the time. And in addition to that, we started having connectivity. I mean, you know, it's kind of funny, like here, to your point about technology being fast and slow, here in the United States, we didn't have, 50%, we didn't hit the milestone of 50% of households having internet access until the year 2007. And if you think about the year 2007 is when the when the iPhone came out, the first version of the iPhone came out. So we had sort of this convergence of these technologies that really made social media take off, because I remember even my earliest forays into social media was I was no longer tethered to a laptop or tethered to my desktop. Even back then, I had connectivity while I was on the commuter train, and I had connectivity through the mobile device, my smartphone. I was able to suddenly access the internet through my smartphone, which was, of course, in 2007 was new at the time. So Web 1 is, again, read only. Web 2 is read write. Web 3 is read, write, and own. So the challenge in the Web 2 world has been, we've given up an awful lot of content and data to these platforms like a Facebook, like a Twitter, like a LinkedIn, where it's garden walled. So we contribute, they've instrumented their platforms. Again, think of engineering and those feedback loops, right? They know what we're looking at, what content we're engaging with, and it's feeding all of those algorithms. Who benefits from that? Well, we might benefit as consumers from the standpoint of there's some convenience, right? There's convenience in that now we can create media like this and amplify it out to millions potentially of people by being able to post content to these different types of platforms. So there's this exchange of convenience. But who's making money off of this? It's the social media platforms that are able to monetize both our content and our data. In the Web 3 world, it flips. So we're still doing user-generated, people-generated content. We can still contribute, and we are still we're giving off this digital exhaust of data. But now with it being captured on technologies like blockchain, it's now giving the community and the individual creators more of the control of being able to, number one, control how and when the media and by whom it's consumed, how and when our media is also monetized beyond the one advertising models that usually is our only option on a lot of these platforms. So Web 3 is read, write, and own.
So how can you connect that then to learning and HR, tokens and NFTs, and how they fit into the world of people in organizations?
So yeah, absolutely. So there are now talent marketplaces like what you referenced before that have actually, some of them have been around for a couple of years now. But what those talent markets do is it's a paradigm shift. So what's happening in the Web3 kind of world, because we have access to these technologies and it's technologies converging, right? So again, like we saw these inflection points in earlier versions of the internet. So we often talk about Web3 as being the internet of value. So Web2 was the internet of information. We could exchange information back and forth, but we couldn't send each other things of value because we didn't have we had what's called the double spend problem, right? So when I send you an email with an attachment, you get the attachment. I no longer have sole control over that attachment anymore. You could send it to a bunch of different people. That's a double spend problem. So one of the problems that we're solving with blockchain and with cryptocurrency, which are basically just tokens that work on that particular blockchain, on that particular network, is that we're able to then exchange things of value because the digital asset that we're trying to exchange with each other actually has the terms of use and the monetization actually embedded within that digital asset itself. So now I can send something to you, I can exchange something with you if it's been minted, which is the appropriate word, on a blockchain. And it has on that blockchain, we're using cryptocurrency in order to be able to transact. We're using the native currency, which is cryptographically signed, right? So theoretically it can't be hacked. The cryptography, it can't be hacked. And we then are using that as the mechanism for exchange. So now I send you that digital asset and there's an exchange of monetary value. We're exchanging on cryptocurrency, but also on the blockchain is embedded within that digital asset is what's called a smart contract. And a smart contract is basically code that defines the terms of use of that digital asset, governs the terms of use of that digital asset, and also the terms of monetization of that digital asset going forward. So that's essentially what an NFT is. So we could take anything, we could take a training course and make it a digital asset. We could mint it to blockchain. We could embed within it a smart contract. And that smart contract could say, there's only one of them as an example, or there could be 1,000 of them, but of whatever quantity, I could say, here's the training course. Every time somebody wants to use this training course, then it's going to cost this much money. And it can only be used in these particular ways, but it's actually programmed into the digital asset. So I don't have to govern that digital asset or oversee it. That code actually reinforces or enforces whatever the terms or the conditions are of the use of that particular thing.
Okay, so it gives a uniqueness to a digital object that's non-fungible means in the non-fungible tokens NFT. It's unique. You have more control over it, accountability, if you like. A lot of those things are kind of worrying. So that brings in a completely new type of exchange between people. So what is a talent token? I think we've all read about NFTs and how somebody sells a JPEG of their first Twitter tweet, for instance, for thousands and thousands of dollars and so on. So maybe people get the sense of an NFT, but what's a talent token?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So now we can make an investment into digital assets like the NFTs, the non-fungible tokens, but we can also make investments into people. So if we step out of the Web3 paradigm for a moment, in the UK, do you have GoFundMe? Do you have do people know about GoFundMe accounts, or being able to, it's like microfinancing where somebody could say, hey, I'm going to take a year off and write a book, and anybody who wants to, basically fund my project, they could do that through some of these Web2 platforms like a GoFundMe.
Yeah, we've heard of that. And crowdfunding is very well understood, I think.
And so what happens with that is, like, let's say that I was going to go write a book, and I asked the community, like, hey, in order for me to take this time off to do this, I'm going to need a little bit of money to cover the living expenses. So I could start some kind of a crowdfunding project. And people could, oftentimes they're structured so they're at different tiers. So if somebody contributed this amount of money or this amount of money or this amount of money, they would get access to different things. So maybe it's an early copy of the book, or they get to read an early version of the manuscript, or they get to participate in a Zoom with me, they get access to me. And we can kind of understand those crowdfunding opportunities. But what happens in that world is that when the project, it's project based, and when that project is done, everybody just sort of disbands, right? Like that relationship is essentially over. If you take that same sort of paradigm, but now you tokenize it. So now you've got a token. So instead, if I said, hey, I'm putting out this $WISE talent token, which is in essence a social token, and I have it minted on a blockchain, and I say, anybody who buys this token at this level, at this level, at this level, gets access to events or masterminds or coaching opportunities or consulting or advisory services, but it now persists over time. So people are making an investment in me, and in the case of a talent token, in my career and the potential opportunities to be able to interact and benefit. But here's the other thing about social tokens. And so again, talent tokens are a subset of the overall social tokens. There are many different types of social tokens, of which talent tokens are one. But with social tokens too, not only does the relationship persist over a period of time, but because we're talking about cryptocurrency on the blockchain, is that by people participating in this marketplace, by people participating in this network, by people participating together and engaging, they also earn rewards and also have access to governance. So again, one of the big things about Web3 is read, write, own. The individuals in the community own and then govern what's happening on a particular platform. So with platforms that tend to issue social tokens in any sort of way, if you're a community participant, you don't have a token of your own, but you've participated you hold either the social token, or in this case, the talent token. Let's say you have $WISE, but then you also have the governance token, which is usually a separate token that's available that's native to that platform. So in this case, it would be it's called TLT. It actually, on the platform that I'm on, it hasn't been released yet, but you can buy into and earn these governance tokens. And then you as a community participant have the ability to be able to vote on the direction of that platform. And that could be features and functionality. That could be who else gets to issue a talent token on that particular platform. But it's the community is actually rewarded for their participation and their attention on the platform.
So as an individual, if I launch a talent token, people are investing in my career. Sorry, excuse me while I struggle to get my head around this. People are investing in my career. What do I get? And what do they get, and when do they get it, and what kind of control does that mean they have over my life? Is that looking at it in too kind of brutal a way, or?
These are excellent questions, but so in issuing a token, you have to make that decision as the person who then is tied to that particular token is, because you have that fulfillment over that longer period of time, right? So if we went back to comparing it to that crowdsourcing, that GoFundMe, it's project related. The project is finite. It's got a beginning and an end. In this case, it's an ongoing relationship. So there's a strategy in thinking about, so, again, I could say, somebody who has 10 WISE talent tokens would be able to get, every ebook that I create, they're automatically going to get a copy of that ebook. But somebody who has 1,000 WISE talent tokens for the duration that they hold, that number of tokens over whatever period of time, let's say that they get access to a monthly group coaching call. And the way that people then can authenticate, like how would you authenticate that you had the actual WISE tokens? That's where digital wallets play a key. So something that people misunderstand about the public nature of some of this data is they think that it's tied to our personal identity. It's not. It's actually tied to our digital wallets. So our digital wallets have a unique identifier to them, again, cryptography. So they have a unique identifier. So where do you store your tokens? You store them in a digital wallet. And so when you're trying to prove or verify that you have the 1,000 tokens or the 10 WISE tokens, it's actually your digital wallet that would authenticate to prove that those tokens exist in your wallet and then give you access to that thing or that particular service. But you could always remain anonymous on the other side of your digital wallet. But what's happening in your digital wallet might be available data for public view.
Right. So how would we relate this to an individual in their career, let's say, I don't know, computer programmer, because this is probably where it's going to happen first. And what would be the part that companies play in that? Or is that a dumb question because companies are not going to be companies anymore? They're going to be DAOs.
Yes and yes. So yes, DAOs, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. So we can look at, as an example, if we flip this around and say, okay, let's say that we all had minted on the blockchain our qualifications, our credentials. Like, let's say that we had a presence on a blockchain where everything about Trish Uhl, her job history, my education, my qualifications, my professional credentials, all of those things was actually available. It was tokenized. It was available in one verifiable form in a digital form on the blockchain. So if that information is all available in a talent marketplace, and I, Trish Uhl, have a talent profile, right? So different than my talent token, I am on a different blockchain and I have a presence and I'm a freelancer, right? So I'm a consultant and I am looking for new opportunities. But instead of working through like a contract house or like a manpower, right? Instead of working through like a third-party opportunity, because they're going to take a percentage off of that interaction that I have with a client project that I do, I want to be able to go direct. Like, I want to be able to interact with the clients directly, but I need the benefit of a technology platform that's going to help make the matchmaking faster, right? So I want the clients, potential clients who are looking for me, to be able to find me. So I can make my history available, minted on the blockchain for a talent marketplace that would allow the potential clients to be able to, in the same way that you vetted me out in a similar fashion, to give them a very quick way of being able to vet me out and then approach and engage. And so as an example that people can go and see and take a look at, there is a decentralized autonomous organization, also known as a DAO, by the name of Brain Trust. And so if you go to usebraintrust.com, it's a talent marketplace. And that's exactly what it is that they're doing, is that they're matching through the technology. There's not a recruiter. There's not, you don't talk to a recruiter. Like, it's literally matching. And we're talking companies like NASA and Nestle and McKinsey. I mean, we're talking some big name companies that are looking for talent in the gig economy to be able to staff for specific teams or for specific projects. And what happens on something like Brain Trust, as an example, is all of the talent gets 100% of the earnings that they make on the projects that they engage with the particular clients, and the clients pay to the Brain Trust Foundation. They pay a flat fee. I believe it's 10%. And that money then actually goes into, with the decentralized autonomous organization that is Brain Trust, the DAO, it goes into the basically the community treasury. And that money actually is used in order to be able to issue more tokens on the platform that gives all market participants, all people on that platform, again, different ways of being able to additionally monetize their time and attention in interacting with that platform.
there's a good deal of vendor activity in the area of recruitment, upskilling, etc. at the moment. And I've seen some plays from companies I've talked to where the service provider not only helps individuals to get upskilled and reskilled by doing what we would call B2C e-learning, but also help them to get into jobs, various kind of online and human delivered help to actually get them directly into their jobs. So kind of closing the gap between job seeker and the organization. And this is, you've seen a lot of movement here, not just from startups, but, you know, from big companies like any of the major platform providers as well, who also have talent marketplaces. It's closing this gap. But what sort of solutions might the emerging technologies you're talking about here have for the skills challenges that organizations currently have? And also, what changes in the nature of work do you foresee as a result of these drivers? So I see things happening in, you know, quite a traditional kind of technology / face-to-face market. And you're talking about things that are driving in the same way, it seems to me. How do you see this all converging and working?
So sitting here in the United States, we have had the luxury, I think Donald Taylor at one point said, you know, with the global sentiment survey, that basically when it comes to learning technology, that if the United States, you know, catches a cold, you know, or sneezes, everybody else catches a cold. Yeah. We have basically led the way in a lot of the innovation in the learning technologies. And I would suggest, because actually most of my work is actually outside of the United States and outside of North America, it's actually in the emerging markets. And I would suggest that it's shifted, right? A lot of these applications of technology that are being used, like these talent marketplaces, are happening outside of the US. And so to answer the question specifically around skills, is that if we take all of the things that we've talked about today, John, and take that same kind of platform, but make it internal to an organization and now put all of your workforce on it, right? So not just your employees, but any of the workers. So they could be contingent workers, freelancers, consultants, contractors, what have you. But if they're all participating in this internal marketplace that is driven by basically a tokenization, right, on blockchain, driven by smart contracts and these digital assets, you wind up with an internal marketplace where you now have kind of visibility into not only the different types of materials that people are engaging with. So again, courses, so instructional assets, informational assets all become digital assets. They all essentially become NFTs that are on this internal blockchain, that are then governed by smart contracts that then create data that can be analyzed within the organization to figure out, are people interacting with the podcast? Are people interacting with the course? Are people interacting with, you know, all of these different types of digital assets, these digital resources that are available on the blockchain?
There's your analytics. You don't need
there's your
anymore.
Analytics. And there's your behavior change.
Yeah.
Because you can incentivize the behaviors that you want in the market. So we can both infer from what's happening by being able to have, you know, to observe what's happening in this marketplace on the analytics and the data, but we can also then incentivize that if people do X, Y, and Z. So if we go all the way back to the beginning of the podcast and talk about that leadership development program, what if those, you know, so again, if we think about that learning system where it's 12 months long, and let's say that it's 12 months and it's 3 different instructional workshops and people have activities that they have to complete in between, and then there's a capstone project at the end of the 12 months, what if all that activity actually happened and was logged on the blockchain? So now you have verified data of what's happening or not happening, as the case may be. Now we can manage risk. Now we can see value creation. Now we have visibility. We're illuminating sort of these things that have been almost a black box in organizations for a long period of time. And we can use that in order to be able to work on behalf of our people in our organization. We can use that in a way of being able to, again, use the tokens, use that tokenization strategy and the smart contracts to be able to reward in that community, in that closed community, the behaviors and the actions that it is that we want people to take. And there's a whole other conversation there about privacy and about surveillance and about all of those types of things.
Where are you seeing this happening? Are you seeing it happening in the learning platforms market, for instance? So I'm not sure I do.
They're starting to, and the reason why I say that is because I'm getting those phone calls. So I'm getting phone calls from product managers that say, hey, Trish, we really want to understand this world. Because again, it's this real paradigm shift, right? We're talking about peer-to-peer. We're talking about decentralized. We're talking about this idea of the community actually has some power and some control over this. That being said, geographically, where is it happening in the world? A lot of this is actually happening out of South America would be one of the big places. There's actually a major bank in Brazil that was one of the first internal talent marketplaces that I was aware of that actually operated in this sort of way. There's also a lot, one of the big places for blockchain in particular right now, I would say the leader as far as a country is concerned is the United Arab Emirates. And hopefully, universe willing here, I'll be back in Dubai in mid-March. So again, we've got these innovations that are happening in other parts of the world outside of North America that are now, again, external forces putting external pressure on organizations and people, and in this case also on national agenda. So we're starting to see where, because of the adoption of some of these types of technologies and these different types of this, shift in mindset, it's now putting more pressure on some of the things that we're doing as countries and as nations, because otherwise, how do our organizations compete on the global stage? And how does our workforce upskill to be able to compete on the global stage?
So interesting. You'll come back and talk to us again after you've been to Dubai. I could easily do another hour on this, but I'm aware that kind of listeners need a podcast that runs for the length of their dog walk or something like that. So
of course,
for now, I think we have to close it down. You quite nicely rounded it off there by referring us back to the first question. So just lastly, quickly, how can people best follow your thought, which obviously is very fast moving, and get in touch with you?
Thank you for that. So LinkedIn is one of the best places to find me. Twitter, I am usually ranting on Twitter. On all of social media, I am at Trish Uhl, so at TRISHUHL. I created the NFT called #CryptoOwls. It's out on OpenSea. We can put in the show notes, we can put a link to that. But I created that as an NFT collection, and I created the WISE talent token specifically so that people in our industry would be able to have assets, digital assets that they could go and play with and take a look at the platforms and see what kind of data is generated and start to wrap their heads around, and then be able to come back to a specific person and be like, okay, Trish, I went and looked at whatever. I have questions. Okay, cool. I'll be on LinkedIn and Twitter. Best place to find me. And thanks, John.
Thank you so much. I'm going for a lie down in a darkened room with a damp towel over my head.
Yay, cake.
And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Trish and to our sponsors Learning Pool and Cornerstone. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Don't miss Great Minds on Learning next week on effective learning, and an upcoming episode here at The Hack on Don Taylor's latest global sentiment survey. He'll tell you what's hot and what's not.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.